Today, I'm going to talk about becoming a psychologist. In my previous lecture, I talked about some of the forces alive in me that finally directed me towards the choice of psychology as a career and some of the bumps on the road to arriving there. And I believe I said that I wound up going to the University of Michigan and to marry my very troubled childhood sweetheart to take with me because I had not had the courage to go off to a strange place and start a new enterprise without anybody accompanying me, no one I could turn to talk about who knew me. And that fatal flaw proved to be a very, very difficult choice that I had made. I many times wish that I had had the courage to go with no one because I think my life would have been spared the trauma that came later. But I did what I did at the time. Uh, Today I will be talking about what I learned was a psychologist, what I was taught about what the field was, some of my early experiences attempting to apply what I was learning to the dilemmas of some clients that were given to me in my training. And in addition, of course, I will continue my discussion of what I was living through personally and how I was changing as a human being. Among other things, I believe I'll have some time to talk about entering psychoanalysis as part of my training in graduate school. I was not required to enter, but we were strongly encouraged to do so. And I think I would have been looked at as a strange person and not a very good student if I hadn't willingly gone into psychoanalysis. And besides, I was interested in seeing what it was like to actually experience the ministrations of a psychoanalyst because I was in a program that was oriented towards teaching people how to do psychoanalysis. It's always good to know what the consumer goes through if you're going to be the provider of services. I want to finish, though, some themes from last time because I'm laughing at myself. I want to imagine my listeners are listening to me and that they have some comfort for me. I want to talk about my problematic girlfriend and some experiences I had with her. Uh, After we had broken up and I thought I would never see her again, she had decided to transfer from UCLA to Berkeley because she wanted to make a fresh start. And I knew through the grapevine that she had started spending time with some other young man, some other male student on the Berkeley campus. I was happy. I was glad. Let her attached to him. I was free. But then my wonderful relationship with the young woman I was in love with at a young age came apart because she didn't have the courage to defy her father's injunctions that I wasn't good enough for her. So I was forlorn, and as I said, I reached back to my former girlfriend to see if she was available. And she was happy to hear from me. I called her in Berkeley. I got her phone number through some mutual acquaintances. And I said that I had made a mistake separating from her and I was ready to consider re-embracing her and making her a part of my life together. And was she willing to get together with me? So we hit upon, it was August, I remember, we hit upon meeting halfway. She would take the Greyhound bus down to Fresno, and I would drive up from Los Angeles. I'd make a reservation at a Fresno hotel, and we would stay there, and we would explore what a relationship with each other would be after that terrible breakup. And so we did, and to my comfort, she had fully become sexual. She was no longer averse to having intercourse with me, as she had been the time we had been together. So we consummated our relationship fully at that point. We enjoyed the time we spent in Fresno, and I drove back by myself to Los Angeles in the summer heat thinking, all right, I'm going to take a chance on this. I got in touch with her again and said I wanted to continue to know her and spend time with her, and would she transfer back to UCLA for the fall semester. And if we continued to enjoy each other's company, we would get married in December. And she came back, and that's what we did. Now, what I have to tell you about is the wedding present I got from her. We were poor, starving students. I'd moved out of my parents' house, and I had rented a small apartment for the last year of schooling. She came to live with me there, and I was looking forward to graduate school. And I had already been working. I had graduated, but hadn't left yet that December. I was going to go the following September to graduate school, and I was already working because I wanted to save money. I didn't know how I would make it on whatever budget the University of Michigan was giving me, what the cost of living would be like. I was being prudent and frugal, so I was supporting myself. And she came to live with me, and we got married. We got married on Christmas Day. That was the only day, it was busy season for some reason. That was the only day we could find a rabbi who would marry us. It was Christmas, and he wasn't working on Christmas, it's something else. So we got married at Christmas. It was a tiny wedding. It was just my mother and my stepfather, and he's a whole other story that I may tell at some point. Her parents, and that was it, and the two of us. And the marriage took place, and because I was a poor, starving student, I had made a reservation at the Surf and Sand Hotel in Laguna Beach, which is really a very lovely and comfortable place. We had one night for a honeymoon, and then she had to get back to class because she hadn't graduated yet, and she had an assignment to at the end of vacation, and I needed to get back to work after Christmas. So we went on our vacation to our one night honeymoon, and I'm waiting in bed for her after dinner. We had a nice time at the beach in the afternoon, and we had a nice dinner in the hotel restaurant. I'm waiting for her in my new PJs after dinner was over. She went into the bathroom, and she seemed to be there for an inordinate amount of time. I couldn't imagine what she was doing in the bathroom. But at last she came out, and she had got a new nightgown for her honeymoon with me, and she looked troubled. And I said, "You were in the bathroom for a long time. You look very troubled. What's happening?" She said, "I guess I have to tell you something." I always hate when somebody says they have to tell me something. I know it's not likely to be something I'm going to enjoy hearing. So I said, "I'm listening. What do you need to tell me?" She said, "I want to make it clear we're not going to have sex tonight." I said, "Oh, well, that's a strange tradition. This is our honeymoon, and we're not going to have sex tonight." She said, "No, we're not going to have sex tonight." And I said, "All right, there must be more to the story than that." She said, "Well, there is." She said, "I made love to you. We did intercourse many times after you came back in my life. I hated every one of those times. I don't like sex, and I don't really want to be a sexual person. Having sex with you is a very, very unpleasant experience for me, so I'm not going to have sex with you tonight, and I don't know when I'll feel like having sex to you again." And I said, "Well, that's a strange wedding present you're giving me." But of course, I was going to be a psychologist. So she was handing me a wonderful challenge. I was about to get my education. I would figure out how to fix it. I would make it better. I would overcome her hesitancy to having sex. And we would somehow go off into that lovely sunset of being romantically and wonderfully entwined with each other. What a fool I was. I should have listened to her. I didn't. I said, "You don't have to have sex with me. I will wait for you to get ready. Maybe you can teach me. Is there anything I can do to help you get ready to have sex with me again?" And she said, "I can't think of anything at the moment." And that was the end of that. And it was actually about 3 more months before we had sex again. We were already in Ann Arbor. The second thing that happened that made me again concerned about what I got myself to was the ride from Los Angeles to I'm forgetting what city Ann Arbor was in. It's been lovely seeing the moment. The ride from here to there. We started off, it was indeed August when we left, and it was very hot. I had a strange little automobile called the Hillman Minx. It was a small British car, very underpowered. but it had a convertible top on it. And we headed out. We were going to go to Las Vegas, make it to Las Vegas the first night, but we never got there. When we were in the vicinity of one of the desert towns between here and there, I could see that my temperature indicator on my dashboard was going up towards the boiling point. Something was wrong with the circulation in the car. It was about to overheat, and I was very alarmed. So I apologized to her. I pulled over to the side of the road. I opened the hood. I couldn't see anything broken. The fan belt was not broken, which is the most usual cause of engine overheating. Everything seemed to be running fine. And I thought there's something wrong with the circulation. Maybe the water pump was broken. Something is wrong in the circulation of the coolant. And it's going to overheat, and the engine's going to burn up. And this is not a good thing. We were about 5 miles from town, so I got back into the car, and I said, please excuse me, I have to turn the heater on. The heater has its own little radiator in it. The heater will help cool the car as the hot water comes from the heater from the circulating system through the heater. I'm sorry, it's going to get very hot in this car. And I can't do anything about that, but that's the only way I'll drive slowly and get us to town so the car can be repaired. And she started screaming at me. She was doing character assassination on me. I can't do anything right. She can't trust me. I can't even give her transportation that's safe to get from here to Ann Arbor, Michigan. I remembered the town's name in class. And now she's boiling me. It's over 100 degrees outside, and I'm contributing to the misery by turning the heater on in the car. And what kind of husband am I anyhow? She thinks she made a terrible mistake marrying me. That was my present for trying to take care of the emergency and get the car to some kind of service. Well, I pulled into town, and there was a car right off the highway. There was a garage right off the highway that said radiators. And I figured that would be a good place to stop. They were still open. It was a Friday afternoon. So I pulled in, and I said, I'm about to overheat. I've had the radiator on. The needle is just coiled up at the breaking point on the dashboard, but I haven't burned out anything, and the car is still running. He said, you better turn it off and let me look at it. And he took the cap off, and this huge geyser of steam came out of the radiator. He looked inside, and he said, your radiator's all stopped up. You probably need a new radiator. Oh, it was Barstow we were stuck in. That's a terrible place. And I said, well, this is a Hillman Minks. The parts are not readily available. There's one dealer in Beverly Hills, and I think that's the only place you get parts. He said, yeah, I recognize the car. Seen pictures of it. Well, best I can do is the place is closed by now. It's after 5 o'clock. I should be closed. He said, I can't get you a radiator anywhere around here for that car. That I can probably arrange to call first thing Monday morning and maybe have it delivered on the Greyhound bus from Beverly Hills to here by later in the day, and maybe even get you out of here by late Monday afternoon. And my wife started screaming, are we going to be stuck in this shithole for 2 days? This is an outrage. And she's yelling and carrying on at the top of her lungs, once again telling me how inept I am and how I can't take care of anything right. And I said, is there anything else that can be done? He said, if you'll authorize me, I can take your radiator, your existing radiator out, and I'll take an acetylene torch and I'll heat the seams that attach the top of the radiator and the bottom of the radiator to the core of the radiator. And I'll see if I can find the blockage in there, and I might be able to clean it out enough to get you running again. He said, your wife seems to be very distressed. I'll work on this on into the evening if I have to, and see if I can get you on the road again. And I said, that would be fine, and I can help. I've worked in an auto repair place. If you need my help, I'll be happy to help you take the radiator out of the car and to work on it together if we need to. And that's what happened. He unsoldered the top of the radiator and the bottom, and he took a metal rod and he started knocking a hard water scale out of the radiator. There was a ton of hard water scale because we didn't put antifreeze in radiators back then. We just put plain water. And the water around Los Angeles is very alkaline, so it had a lot of hard water scale that accumulated in the radiator. And he says, getting late, it was close to 11 o'clock at night when he finished. He said, you better not hit the road tonight. Everybody's tired and upset. There's a hotel 3 blocks from here. You can walk to the hotel, keep the car here. I'll finish assembling it. It'll be ready for you in the morning. And that's what we did. And that was my send-off with her to Ann Arbor, Michigan. Another warning signal. Sex is going to be a terrible problem. She has an awful temper, and when she doesn't get her way or feels like she's being taken advantage of in some way, she screams and does character assassination on the person she wants to hold responsible. She didn't thank me for being creative. She didn't thank me for keeping the car running. She didn't thank me for being a good problem solver. No, she was screaming at me. All right, that's enough about her for now. Off we went to Ann Arbor, Michigan. We made a stop in East Lansing, among other places. I had never been to Michigan State, as well as I had never been to the University of Michigan. And I thought, oh, how nice, we're here. The road goes right by the university. Let's detour for about 30 minutes, 45 minutes, and see what the campus of Michigan State University looks like. And it is beautiful. It is a gorgeous campus. It looked like heaven to me. And I thought, oh, if Ann Arbor is half as nice as this, we're going to be very happy in school. So off we went the rest of the way to Ann Arbor, Michigan. And I got the last of the ominous warnings that I should have heeded. There was a huge torrential downpour just as we were coming into Ann Arbor. And the road off the freeway and into the town went under a railroad underpass. You go down off the freeway and then up a little hill to a signal to the street that is the main drag in Ann Arbor, Michigan. And as I had gone through the underpass, under the railroad tracks going over me, they had been full of water. There was a kind of small flood because of how intensely the thunderstorm was raining down, and without knowing it, my brakes had gotten wet. So I pulled up the hill to stop at a signal behind the car in front of me, and I put the brakes on, and the car just slid. The brakes were not working because the brake drums were wet, and my brake pads were wet, and I just banged into the back of the car in front of me, pushing in my grill and bending up my bumper. I did very little damage to the other guy, fortunately. But this was a wonderful greeting to Ann Arbor, Michigan. I had an accident on the way in. And again, my former wife is yelling at me for I was driving too cluelessly and too dangerously. And why am I putting her life at risk? And can I drive any better than that? Maybe she should just take over and do all the driving now. Yelling and yelling. All right, I will stop with domestic stress and move on to my education. I received a very warm welcome at the university. I was disappointed because in contrast to Michigan State, the campus seemed very ugly to me. There had not been much work done on it since World War II, and austerity reigned in World War II. There are many old and decrepit buildings. It was not an attractive place to be. The psych building was fairly new, but the psych clinic was in an old Victorian house, and there were many buildings on campus that looked like they had been built around the turn of the 20th century, let alone the late 20th century that we were now headed towards. So I was not enthusiastic. In addition, my wife had asked a cousin of hers who was a graduate student at Ann Arbor to find an apartment for us and have it ready for us so we could settle in. We went to look at the place, and it was awful. It was terrible. I didn't want to live there. She didn't want to live there, so we had to find where the landlord was, tell her we weren't going to sign a lease, go to a hotel, and start a frantic search for where we were really going to live. That was quite stressful. Those problems got solved. We found a place to live, and I went to the university, and I was told I was welcome, I was given registration materials, told where to go to register, and said that there would be a welcoming reception and an orientation for the incoming students the next day. I had known that there was going to be something the next day. That's when we arrived, when we did. But I didn't know what that was going to consist of. So I registered the morning of the next day, and I went off to meet the faculty and my fellow students. I was very surprised to know that only 12 of us had been selected. I was a class of 12. I had some foreshadowing of that before I left, but now I saw there were actually only 12 students selected out of many hundred. And they were a mixture of males and females. Most of us were an unusual group. We were the first group of people that had come directly out of undergraduate school into graduate school. We were in our early 20s. Everybody in the classes ahead of us were returning veterans by and large. There were very few people who had come directly from undergraduate school to graduate school. And on the average, the veterans were 10 years older than we were. They were grown-ups. I still felt like a kid in many ways. The other thing we were informed is that there was not going to be a culture of competitiveness in the department. They wanted us all to succeed. Nobody was going to be stressed to see if they could take it and then flunked out, like Harvard Law School, for instance. They hoped that we would cooperate with each other. They warned us they would give us much too much to study, and it would be impossible for us to read everything that they had assigned to us that they wanted us to read. They showed us where the student lounge was, and there was a spirit duplicating machine there. They told us we could cooperate on assignments. We could divide up the readings. We could take responsibility to read things and then prepare synopses of them or notes about them to give to each other. They wanted us to study together and to work together as much as possible and as much as was helpful. And they weren't looking to flunk out anybody. So that sounded very, very reassuring to me. In addition, I began to learn more about the theoretical orientation of the program and about what they were going to expect of me. I'll start with the latter. The thing they expected was we were to take an examination the next day. It would be in 12 parts. It was about 12 areas of psychology that they expected us to know something about during the first year of residence. We had been prepared in different programs with different kinds of classwork, and they wanted us to have a uniform base under us, a uniform knowledge about the field of psychology. So we would be tested in all 10. Any of the 10 we passed, if we passed the test on that 10, we would not have to take the exam again. But if we failed the test in any of those areas, we would have to do some extra work during the year. There were reading lists available about how to prepare those areas. And by the end of the year, we would have to pass all 10, all the ones we had not passed the first time around. So that was scary. And we all showed up for all-day testing the next day. And I took the test, and I can brag a little bit. I passed 8 of the 10 the first time around. I'd managed to get very good preparation at UCLA, and I'd remembered a lot. So I only had 2 extra things to study. Some of my new colleagues had 7, 8, 9. One of them, Tom Greening, who became my dear friend, had not even had an undergraduate major in psychology. He had had a Fulbright scholarship to Austria to study world history, and he knew practically nothing about psychology, and yet they wanted to have an interesting mix of people as students. So on an experiment, they had let him into the graduate program, but that poor bastard had to work like a dog the first year, learning all about the coursework that he should have learned in undergraduate psychology, and he managed to pass we all managed to pass all 10 of them by the end of the year. He somehow did all his current work and brought himself up to speed about the things he was deficient in that year. We were a smart group of people. About the psychoanalytic orientation of the program, that faculty had rescued at least two people who had been psychoanalysts in Germany before the war and had given them faculty positions. One of them taught the Rorschach class. He, he was not only, he was a psychologist, psychoanalyst in Germany, and he knew projective testing very well. So he was going to teach our Rorschach class, and the other guy was appointed the director of the psychology clinic. And the clinic was run as a psychoanalytic institute in many ways. And his name was Fred Wyatt. He anglicized his name. Must have been Weiss or something like that in German, but he took an English form of his name when he came to the United States. And he was a marvelous human being. I enjoyed every minute I spent with him. In my third year, I got an internship at the clinic and got mentored by him. But we were to study traditional psychoanalysis. We would be exposed a little to the competing frames of reference that existed in our field. We would learn something about them, but we would be expected to become very proficient and knowledgeable about psychoanalytic theory, about projective testing, about interviewing, and those were the main core skills that we were going to learn. In addition, I forgot about this. In addition, if we were to get PhDs, of course, we had to do a doctoral dissertation. And they were done by apprenticing ourselves to one of the core faculty members, every one of which had to be engaged in ongoing research studies and doing some project under the tutelage of one of the core faculty members. And it had to be in a form that could be prepared for publication. And we didn't have to get it accepted for publication necessarily, but we had to submit it for publication to a journal that might be interested in the work that we had done as our doctoral dissertation. And we had the course curriculum we would be taking could be completed in 4 or 5 years. If we're very fortunate, we would start on our dissertation in the third of those years, and maybe we would be done, but we had up to 7 years to get the dissertation done. Some of us would have trouble. Some of us would pick projects that were ambitious and could not be completed quickly. We would have a doctoral committee that would supervise us and coach us and help us, but the school would be lenient. We would have up to 7 years to get the work done and receive our degrees. But that was an absolute cutoff. If we didn't succeed in finishing in 7 years, we would be terminated from the program, and we would be called what's called in the jargon of academic institution, ABDs, all but dissertations. There's a whole large group of people out there wandering around the wilderness who are ABDs from various universities. They could not manage to get a doctoral dissertation done properly. So I had my marching orders and I started. What was noteworthy for me was the first year we had a practicum experience. It was not called an internship. It was like a laboratory to implement and experiment with one of the skills we were being taught. We were being taught objective testing then. We were taught intelligence testing, and we were taught aptitude and interest testing and the interpretation of various instruments that measured those. Our practicum site was the Dearborn Veterans Administration, where we would go off and the psychiatrist would refer one or another of their patients to us because they were interested in having an aptitude test done, having an interest test, a vocational interest test done, having some kind of intelligence test done, and on referral from psychiatrists, we would be testing veterans. None of that stands out very much, except one thing: we did it as a team. In order to make sure that the testing would be done reasonably and thoroughly, two of us would administer any particular test, with one of us doing the actual administration, the other watching to make sure we were doing it properly. I also had a chance, because I was there on the right day, to go to grand rounds every week. And that was grand rounds of the psychiatry department. That was a time where all the paraprofessionals, the nurses in the psychiatric unit, the psychiatrists, the technicians of various kinds, and we psychology practicum students would all gather in the hospital auditorium, and some veteran who was seemingly problematic in some way would be brought in a wheelchair to sit on the stage, and the chief resident would present his background, his presenting symptoms, what the treatment issues were that were problematic, and then a consultant would be there who would come in from the community because the consultant was an eminent person in some way or another. The eminent person would hold open comments about what he saw in this case, suggestions he would make to the treating psychiatrist, his formulation of what was troubling the patient and what should be done about it. We didn't have much to do back then. We did shock treatment. We did therapeutic massages. We had what was else? Vocational therapy and occupational therapy and art therapy. Those were the things we had available for treating the poor veteran. Individual therapy was almost unheard of. That was back in the day. Shock therapy was the usual thing. If they didn't get better, they were buzzed. And I can remember the first day at Grand Rounds. It was the day that myself and 5 other practicum students had arrived to do our testing work. And the resident in charge asked us to stand up and introduced us by names to all the people who would be our colleagues in one way or another. We introduced ourselves. And he said, you know who these psych students are. They're the x-ray technicians of the psyche. That's how he introduced us. We had these strange instruments that we administer. We could make comments about parts of the personality with these strange instruments we were administering. He said, remember, we have the interns who have been here for 1 year already. They administer other kinds of tests. They administer tests of personality. They are really, they're like the people who get into the deep portions of the personality and x-ray them for us. Clearly, we were to have no kinds of treatment responsibility of any kind. In the house of medicine, physicians are king, and everybody else serves the kings and does not presume to take on any of the functions of the king. I got my indoctrination in the relationships between psychology and psychiatry very, very early on. I did remember one grand rounds. There was a veteran rolled onto the stage, and he looked very uncomfortable. He was sweating. He was looking furtively in a variety of directions. His body language said that he did not want to be there, and he was frightened of what was happening to him. The consultant who came in was named Harrison Sadler. Harrison Sadler was a psychoanalyst in training, and he had been a psychiatrist for already about 10 years. He had done his residency at the hospital. That's how I knew him. He had been chief resident, so he had been a leader. And even though he had decided to go back to psychoanalytic training, they valued his inputs, and they invited him to be there that day to see this particular patient. And Dr. Sadler was seated up on the stage watching the patient arrive, and he came up and said, Mr. So-and-so, you look uncomfortable. Are you feeling uncomfortable being here? And he said, yes. No, he didn't even answer. He nodded his head yes. And then Dr. Sadler said to him, would you prefer not to be here? And he nodded his head yes again. And Dr. Sadler said, well, we'll let you go in a minute. I need to hear some things about you because I want to fulfill my commitment. I promised to try and help you, but I can't help you without information. So could you please just sit here and listen, and maybe you can correct anything that you hear from the presenting resident chief that isn't correct, but otherwise you don't have to answer. You don't have to do anything. So the chief resident gets out this sheaf of paperwork in his file, and and said, the patient was born on such and such. He keeps talking to the audience as if the patient wasn't there. He didn't acknowledge the patient in any way. I don't remember what they were. He said some things that were probably very embarrassing and very private for the poor guy sitting on the stage. But again, he's talking about him as if he was a thing or a specimen of some kind. He didn't even call him by name, and he didn't honor his humanity in any way. And I could see that Dr. Sadler was wincing. And when the chief resident got finished with his presentation, Sadler turned and apologized to the patient. He said, you probably didn't like what you were hearing and how Dr. So-and-so was talking about you. I wouldn't blame you. That must have been hard to listen to. And if you choose not to say anything more, I honor that. And he said to the aide, we'll give him a few seconds to see if he wants to say anything. And he shook his head no. And he said to the aide, would you please take him off the stage and return him to his room? So I was very touched. Here was somebody who cared about the feeling states of this person and was sensitive to what he might be going through and treated him not as a thing or a specimen or an object, but as a fellow human being. And he said, oh my, if I ever want to go into psychoanalysis, I think I would choose him to go into psychoanalysis with. And as fate would have it, I did wind up going into psychoanalysis with him. And that's another story, probably for later today, for another time. So those are the main experiences that I remember about my training. The coursework seemed good to me. I enjoyed being in classes. The quality of instruction was good. I was doing my same shtick. I was trying to show off as much as possible. I was trying to prove that I was smart and that I could learn and that I knew things. And whenever there was a question asked, I was eager to try and answer it. Whenever somebody was asked to come up with an example or something, I rushed to come up with some example or something. And I would try and have my say in the classroom. I also buddied with at least 3 other of my classmates into a study group. We formed our own. It didn't seem workable to have a study group of all 12 students, but at least 3 of us started dividing up the work, writing things for each other, reading parts of what we had to cover, and letting the other parts go. And I learned to play bridge. That's the other thing I did when I was in graduate school. At least 2/3 of the people I was going to school with played bridge. I know my parents have played bridge. The game sort of interested me, so I asked one of them to teach me in spare time, and I learned to play bridge. And we had this crazy bridge playing frenzy. One class would adjourn at the end of the class period, and then there was always a 10-minute interval between that and our next class. And we would rush to the bridge table, deal one hand of bridge, and try and finish the hand in 10 minutes like crazy people. And that was a standard form of recreation between classes. I also learned that I didn't like driving to Detroit. Detroit was the ugliest big city in the United States that I had ever seen, and I was going to be happy when my year's sojourn in the Detroit Veterans Administration was over, because it was 55 miles one way. And while we carpooled, it was still, I had to get up fairly early in the morning because we were due there at 9. I usually had to get up at 6 or 7 in the morning at the latest and rush through a shower, gulp something, get in the car. And in the wintertime, it was hair-raising to drive there because there was snow or freezing rains, and still we had to get there in time. Oh, I can still remember. So on the home front, things did not improve much. My former wife, in addition to whatever was troubling her, became tremendously hypochondriacal. It was hard for her to be away from Los Angeles and from her support group of girlfriends and from her parents, and the additional stress of being in a strange place, of trying to learn to make friends. And she was in her last year. She transferred to the University of Michigan to finish up her last year of college. Work was crumbling her, and she frequently thought that she saw cancer. She once looked into the mirror and saw that one of these little bones on her neck, the left-hand one, it's the knob on it seemed a little bit bigger than the knob on the right-hand one, and she was convinced that she had a bone tumor there, and I had to drop everything and rush her to the emergency room at the University of Michigan Hospital so she could have somebody look at her neck. And of course, there was nothing wrong. I think we made about 12 visits to the emergency room in my first year of residency in Ann Arbor. She would get somebody else to take her occasionally when I was in Dearborn, too. Oh, my God. And she was inconsolable. No words of comfort would comfort her. I began to remember a terrible trauma she had had the year before I met her. She had had a favorite aunt, and she and her aunt were out on a shopping expedition, and then they stopped for lunch. And suddenly, in the middle of lunch, after the shopping expedition, I think my former wife was 14 then. The wife suddenly started, the aunt started screaming in pain and fell over onto the floor of the restaurant they were in, writhing and screaming in pain. And help was summoned, and whoever were the paramedics then came. And it turned out that her spine had collapsed, and the raw ends of her spine were digging into her spinal cord. They had to give her heavy sedation to get her to the hospital. And it turned out she had sarcoma of the spine. She had a horrible cancer eating her spine away. And it had also already metastasized to other bones that hadn't collapsed yet. So she was told she did not have much longer to live. And my my poor former wife was haunted by the imagery she lived through. She rode to the hospital with her. She had no other transportation to get anywhere. We went to the hospital with her, and she visited her frequently while she was dying. And the dying was hideous and terrible and painful and awful. And there's no doubt that this was a horribly traumatic experience for my former wife. And now she herself was afraid that she was going to get cancer and she was going to follow a similar fate. I also heard more stories about her. She had been a very troublesome child. She was hideously envious of her older sister, who was 4 years older than she, who was very beautiful, got a full scholarship to go to NYU drama school, and was now a struggling actress in New York, and formidably intelligent, very beautiful, had endless suitors, and my client felt like the ugly, my client, she should have been my client. My wife felt like she was the ugly duckling of the family, and she resented her older sister terribly. I heard stories about family outings where the family was not going to go. And she thought her parents favored the older sister and were not interested in her at all. And when the family was scheduled to go on an outing somewhere, frequently she would figure out how to throw up and get sick so she could ruin the family outing. And she wouldn't have to be cooped up with her older sister and her parents because she knew she was going to be ignored and neglected, and she couldn't possibly compete with the older sister. My final piece of wisdom about my former wife, and then I will stop talking about her, is that her mother had a stupid, awful, traumatizing way of disciplining her children when she was cross purposes with them. Her favorite method of getting them to listen or to behave was not to be patient and thoughtful with them, but she would rush to the bathroom, she would lock the door, she would start yelling and rattling bottles, and she would yell, she's taking poison and she's killing herself. And then she would lie down on the floor silently and just lie there and not answer the pounding on the door or anything. She would make 20 or 30 minutes go by before she would get up and walk out and say, I guess I didn't die this time, and resume being connected to her children. But they were frequently frightened that this time it's going to be real and she is going to kill herself. Lovely present. Lovely way to raise children. So let me move on. Late in the first year, It was tense and still difficult between the two of us. We were barely having sex at all. And I discovered when we had sex that my wife probably wasn't emotionally present. She would close her eyes. She looked like she was thinking about something somewhere else on some other planet, and she wasn't experiencing me or bonded with me or responding to me in any way. It was as if she was just gritting her teeth, waiting for it to all be over with. Somewhere along the road, I came to the conclusion that she was probably molested and never talked about it to anybody. But I don't know for sure. I just know that her sexuality was all screwed up and that she had a hard time allowing herself to be with or be bonded with another human being. We decided, since I was encouraged to go into therapy, she decided that she would too. Both of us go into psychoanalysis. The program had worked out a relationship with both of the Detroit and there was no institute in Ann Arbor, but the few analysts who were in Ann Arbor, there was a relationship that students of the university would be given vastly decreased fees if they wanted to go into analysis. But there was a gatekeeper. We had to see the psychoanalyst in Detroit, who was the president of the Detroit Institute. His name was Richard Sterbe. He was a German analyst who had migrated to Detroit. He was much esteemed. He taught many courses at the Institute, and he did many training analyses of people wanting to become analysts. And by the way, back in the year 1955, it was, when I was in residence and going through these experiences, everybody who was in psychiatric residency, the ones who were the most capable and the most interesting, I am not going to answer that, let my phone take it. The ones who are the most capable at following the craft, they all wanted to go on to analytic training after their psychiatric training. That was the top of the mountain for psychiatrists. That brought the best prestige, the best esteem, the best access to positions in various clinics or teaching positions, and brought the most money. It was the best way to be a psychiatrist, was to become a psychoanalyst. That's so different now. The best way to be a psychiatrist is not to be a psychiatrist. It's the least esteemed profession in medicine right now. It has the lowest rate of wanting admission. It pays the least in money earned annually of any of the professions, of any of the branches of medicine. And it is now a branch of medicine where the residencies are filled at least 40, if not 50%, with people coming from training from foreign countries rather than Americans who are eager to become psychoanalysts. That is not a big prestige profession anymore. I'll comment more about that in future lectures. It's a topic that I will come back and recur. What is psychiatry's position in American society right now? What is psychiatry's relationship with psychology right now? All of that is very different than what I've described to you about what started when I was in graduate school. But, as I was saying, by the end of my first year in graduate school, it was even earlier than the end, because I remember it was still wintertime when we went to see Richard Sterbe. Both my wife and I decided we would enter analysis. And off we went to have our visit with Richard Sterbe. Of course, he didn't see us together then. Doing conjoint therapy with a pair of people was only being invented. It was not very much pursued yet. So he saw us at his home on a Sunday, because he set aside Sunday time to do this extra function for everybody, for us and for the members of the Institute. And he was to be the matchmaker. And I can still remember he had nice fire burning in his fireplace. It was a winter day. He had a beautiful house in Grosse Pointe, Michigan. That's the wealthiest suburb of the place. Obviously, he had made a lot of money since he had come to the United States. And he deferred to my wife first and spent about an hour with her while I waited and read magazines. Then he saw me and he talked to me about what my career aspirations were, what I think were the issues were that I would have to address if I went into an analysis. Uh, he did almost a vocational study on me. What did I like to do in my spare time? What was my worst fear? He had some kind of interview that he was used to giving to people who were interested in psychoanalysis. And he made it very clear to me, as I had heard later he had made to my wife, that if I went into psychoanalysis, it represents a very serious commitment. I would need to come 4 times a week because the person I was seeing in training was to do very orthodox psychoanalysis. And I would have to come for a long period of time. This was not a brief thing. It was going to go on certainly for at least a few years. And was I prepared to make that kind of commitment to come all the way from Ann Arbor, Michigan to Grosse Pointe, Michigan? Maybe he could find an analyst in Ann Arbor. He thought of one in Ann Arbor who would be really good for my wife, but he wasn't coming up with names for me right now. Would I be willing to come to Grosse Pointe, Michigan and do this open-ended for at least certainly the rest of my graduate career in graduate school, and maybe I would be expected to stay on afterwards, find a way to move to Detroit or stay in Ann Arbor so the analysis could continue. That would be between me, my analyst, and the person who was then supervising my analyst. And I made the commitment. I was going to show how devoted I was to my calling, how willing I was to learn, how willing I was to heal myself. I was going to be very, very good. Then he said to me, the person I'm thinking of for you, and here's his address and phone number, is named Harrison Sadler. I said, oh my God. I said, I've seen him at grand rounds at the Detroit Veterans Administration Hospital. I'd be very happy to see him. And he said, all right, go call on him and see if the two of you can work it out. And we came back to Ann Arbor after that. And sure enough, my wife was given an analyst in Ann Arbor, so she didn't have to make the commute. And I went off to meet Harrison Sadler, and I started my analysis. Yes, I'm still talking about graduate preparation for my career, so let me talk about the graduate preparation that was provided me by my analyst. Now, I was studying the technique of psychoanalysis. I knew what was expected of me. I would be told that I was to lie on the couch. I was going to be told that I needed to free associate. That meant that I needed to pay attention to my stream of consciousness as it streamed through my awareness, and I was to name and tell all of it, to not withhold anything, to not fall silent, to not fall back into doubt, and my analyst would sit behind me, and I would have to wait for him to comment. He would comment when there was reason for him to comment. It may not make any sense to me, but I was to leave him alone and not bother him, and trust him to do what was necessarily done with my stream of consciousness and my free association. And that was essentially what was explained to me by Harrison Sadler, too. I noticed there was very little to identify him, his taste, or anything. He did have one picture of himself with 2 boys who were maybe middle school age, and he did have a picture of a sailboat up on his wall. And I found through the grapevine at the Dearborn Institute that he had been a Navy man during World War II and had been mustered out of the Navy. So I didn't have about that much information about him. I knew his office was above stores on the 2nd floor in a nice shopping center in Grosse Pointe, Michigan. And it was a very pleasant space. It was pleasant to be there. I could see trees outside of the window, too. That's about all I could see from where I was lying on the couch. He didn't know a commitment I had made to myself. The commitment was I was going to take this very seriously. I would have my orientation by him. I knew it by heart already from my studies. And I was going to be the best patient he ever had. I would never fall silent. I would never resist. There would be no resistance. I would be transparent completely. I would always be there on time. I would never be late. That's a form of resistance, too. I was never going to miss an appointment at all. I would take vacations when he took vacations. I would not take any interruption or vacation on my own. And I would make sure I didn't get sick, so I'd have to miss an appointment because I got sick. I never even formulated it for myself until after I left analysis, but I knew I had already, without knowing, a very strange transfer there. He was a good, kind father surrogate. That's what he was. I saw his kindness from my first exposure to him, and I was going to have him love me. He was going to fill in that aching void in me that came from my father's stern and aloof manner and then his death when I was 12. I had a surrogate that I would prove how worthwhile I was to him. And while he might not ever say the words, I love you, I would spellbind him with the beauty and nobility of my psychoanalytic performance as someone being analyzed, and he would have no choice but to love me richly. And everything I did in analysis was an attempt to achieve that outcome. And I never talked about that. I never said a word about it. And he never brought it up. The analysis went very strangely. As I think about what he needed to talk to me about, that would have been one of the first things he needed me to talk to me about it. And that was never a topic of conversation between the two of us. I do remember that most of the time, and I knew that this was traditional in Orthodox analysis, I would come into the waiting room because he would be seeing somebody else. I would be early to prove to him I was not resisting. And he would let the other person being analyzed out the exit door from the consulting room. And then I would hear him, he was probably tidying up or putting a new Kleenex on the pillow on the couch and getting ready for me. Maybe he was going to urinate. I didn't know what he was doing, but it would take a few minutes. And then he would say, come in. He always had the same words, come in. Didn't shake my hand, didn't say hello, nothing, but come on in or come in. And I would lie down on the couch. I know where to go. And I would hear him seating himself behind me. He had a leather chair, so it kind of creaked when he sat down. And I knew when he had fully sat down. And then I would immediately begin free association. I would go on for 50 minutes. Most sessions I would go on for 50 minutes doing all the talking. And then at the end of the session, he would say, it's time to stop now. And I would get up and I would walk out the exit door and I would drive back to Anarch. Once, maybe twice a week, he would say something to me. He would say, you were talking about some memory from childhood. Do you think it might have something to do with blood? He would connect it with something else I had been talking about. Are the two of those things related in any way? And then my free associations would go in that direction and onward to wherever else they took me. I don't even remember the content of any of the interpretations he'd made me in the 3.5 years I actually stayed with him. Not one of them has stuck with me. Nor do I have any feeling like my life had improved because of some connection he made, something he said to me, something he encouraged me to do. Never encouraged me ever to do anything. That was not part of his therapeutic repertoire. He was very pure. He only made connections. He only made interpretations. He never gave any kind of advice or any kind of counsel about anything. There was one exception. It was in the second year of my analysis. By then, we had put a carpool together because many of my fellow graduate students were actually also had seen Sturba and had been referred to analysts in the Grosse Pointe area, because that's where most of them were situated. So I was such a good person. My appointment with my analyst was at 8 o'clock, 4 mornings a week. I had to get up at 4 o'clock in the morning in Ann Arbor to get ready, because the roads would be terrible sometimes, and we're in a carpool, so other people had to be picked up, and I had to cycle around through the town if it was my turn to drive, picking up other people rather than waiting for them to pick me up. And off we would go. And on this particular day, I'm remembering, I was the driver, and it was a horrible day. Freezing rains were coming down all over southern Michigan, and the roads were treacherous. I saw at least 4 cars go off the road and crash into an embankment during my ride from Ann Arbor to there. I skidded several times out of control, and I had to fight to regain the control as I skidded on the ice. I was really in a high degree of arousal and sweating by the time, and fear and just relief that I had gotten there by the time I had gotten to my session. And then I marched, and I lay down on the pillow, and I started free associating. What was in my mind was my harrowing trip, and I said, "That was a bitch. Let me tell you what I went through." And I thought I shouldn't be telling him anything. I should have been free associating. I apologized. I said, "Oh, I forgot. I acted as if I was talking to you. I'm not. I'm back. I'm free associating again." I slipped. I apologize. I had to be a good patient. And I went on, and I finished my tale, and I said, "And then I walked up the stairs and you let me in." And to my surprise, I was about to watch to see what rose in my consciousness. Oh, I forgot another part of this. I had rich dreams almost every time I came, because I knew the royal road to the unconscious, as Freud wrote, is through dream interpretation. So if I was going to be a good person being analyzed, I had to have very interesting, very lengthy, very vivid, and rich dreams full of symbolism. And I never succeeded in not generating one of those for any particular session. I was really the perfect candidate for analysis. But on this day, he surprised me. He said, "What's the route you take to come here?" I said, "What?" As if I didn't hear him. He said, "What's the route you come to take here?" I said, "This is strange. What does this have to do with analysis? Am I telling him what route I take to be here?" But it felt good. So I described where I got on the freeway in Ann Arbor, how far I had to go from where I lived to get on the freeway, and then I had to merge with another freeway at a certain point, and then what exit I got off when I got to Detroit, and then what surface streets I drove to get finally to park in front of his building. And he listened, and he went on. He said, "There's a way you could come that might save you 10 minutes each trip." And that sounded wonderful. I said, "Oh, I can save 10 minutes? That would really be a blessing. Sometimes it takes me as much as an hour and a half or 2 hours, depending on conditions. So even 10 minutes would be wonderful." He said, "Oh, no, I'm not going there. That's not supposed to be what we should be doing. I'll be quiet again." And I got angry for the first time. I said, "You're going to be quiet again? What is this? You think I'm too stupid to understand the advice you might give me? That I couldn't figure out how to use the usefulness of what you're telling me? This analysis so pure, you can't step out of your role for 2 seconds and give me some kind of practical help?" And somehow I persuaded him. He said, "All right, here's what you should consider doing. Get off the freeway at blah instead of blah, and take this street instead of the street you took, and I think you'll get here sooner. Now I'm going to be quiet. I'm really going to be quiet." And I cherished that conversation. He and I really had a human interaction with each other. We were actually real. We were saying, and we were in a back and forth with each other. Not, I was a specimen that he was observing, and he was going to give me a few comments on my mental productions once in a while. We were problem solving together. It felt wonderful. That was the closest I had to feeling loved by him, was the mistake he was making. He probably paid a terrible price when he went to his supervisor and told his supervisor the stupidity he had slipped into doing with me. He was probably told, watch out, clients are treacherous. They'll pull you out of your analytic role if you let them, and you must never let them do that. I know the game very well. I learned to play it myself. It's a terrible game. I hate it now. It's not a good game, and nobody should play that game. The other time I remember is my last session. I had gotten a job. It was quite a day, that last session. I took my final orals in the morning. I turned in my final copy of the dissertation in the afternoon. He had asked me to change my appointment to the late afternoon that day. And of course, if he needed me to change the appointment, I would change the appointment. We both knew it was going to be the last appointment because I was headed out of town. I was going to come back from Grosse Pointe, stop back in Ann Arbor, pick up my wife. Everything was packed. We were going to put everything in the car, and we were going to head west into the setting sun, starting our journey back to Southern California. I'd been hired to join a group practice in Sherman Oaks, California. I was going to start my career as an official psychologist, not as a psychology graduate student. And that would be the last time I would see him. He said he would leave it up to me whether I wanted a referral in Los Angeles or not. He himself did not personally know anybody to refer me to, but I might want to try, as he said, pedaling your own bicycle on your own for a while to see how it felt not to be an analysis. And if you decide you want to go back into analysis in Los Angeles, you can ask your colleagues who live there for suggestions, and I'll certainly do some research for you, and I'll, as best as I can, I'll give you some suggestions about who to connect up with and who lives in the city you're going back to. Then he said at the end of the session, I'm trying to free associate as best as I can and continue to be the good analytic client. Towards the end of the session, he said to me, all right, it's time to stop now. And he said, there's something, oh, I remember. He had been born in England and had emigrated to the United States as a teenager. He still had a twinge of a British accent. He said, there is something that's traditional in England that's appropriate right now. I said, what's that? He said, many English gardens have sundials in them. And there's a favorite set of sayings that are engraved on those sundials. But the one that captures the most attention by the most people and is likely to be in their garden says, and one of these shall be the last. Knowing that days are not endless, nobody's days are endless, and even the planet's days are not endless. So this is your turn. This is the last. And I thanked him for telling me about the sundials, and I left. And I walked into my car, unlocked it, and got in. And I proceeded to cry my heart out. I'm getting tearful now. What the hell was I crying about? I tried to figure out what I was crying about. It felt to me like it was going to be the last time I would see him. And it felt to me like there had been a tragedy between the two of us. I knew him to be an exceptionally thoughtful and kind person, but my quest had failed. I did not get him to show much kindness or caring for me. Maybe I'd convinced him I was the most brilliant, the most worthwhile, the most thoughtful, the most interested analytic patient he was ever going to have. I'll never know if I did or I didn't, but this was the last time I was going to see him. And I started grieving and crying about my loss of him. And I cried again because my father had died. All the way to Ann Arbor, I was crying. And I cried again because we were going to be leaving Ann Arbor. And while I hated that town when I first arrived, I had grown to know it well. And I had almost stayed. That's another part of my story. They made me a very nice job offer before I went. And I could have stayed if I'd wanted to, and probably even made more money than I would joining the group practice I was in. I would have had a more interesting life. I was going to teach part-time. I was going to join the staff of the psych clinic. And I would also be able to do any research I wanted to do. And it was a nice package, and it paid very handsomely. But I was going to go back to my first love. I was going to practice psychology because that's what I had learned to want to do when I was an undergraduate. And now I thought that's what I learned to have the tools to do well. So I'm going to do that. So I picked up my wife, and she was packed, and we were ready. She, by the way, had finished her remaining undergraduate session, and she had lived out her dream. She had become a elementary school teacher in the next town over in Ypsilanti, Michigan. So we were living now very nicely. We had not only the fine financial aid that the university gave me, but we had her salary too. So we were living in a very nice apartment. We bought a new car. The quality of life was much better, and it's no wonder I was tempted to stay where I was in Ann Arbor, Michigan, rather than coming back to town. Oh my God, I've run way over time. So I think I better stop now, and I will turn this over to you people. Oops, I hit the wrong button, so I won't hit the next one. I'm still here. Comments. Oh, by the way, Cerrito Fear did join us. She likes coming periodically on Fridays when she can get away.
Arthur, what
Arthur,
or who?
go ahead.
I'm sorry.
Go ahead.
What or who inspired you the most during your graduate time?
Two people. It was a tie. One was the director of the clinic. He was erudite. He was the most learned person I could know. He was like a version of Jim Bugental, although in psychoanalytic art. Jim believed in the importance of the arts and the humanities and being a learned person. He believed so strongly that that was a part of the armamentarium of anybody who wanted to be a good therapist. And Fred Wyatt shared those beliefs. We spent a lot of time in our psych meetings talking about the opera that was coming to town, or Freud's writings on the humanities, or what novel we should be reading because it contains important psychological insights. And he was very adept with clients. He never was at a loss for words. If we were ever stuck, then he would find something to talk to us about out of Freudian literature that would be of relevance. He was very good at what he did. Finally, I got him to love me. In the second year, I was there for the last two of my 5 years in residence in the program. In the last year, he decided he wanted to experiment with something different. Usually, our staff meetings every Tuesday over lunch hour where who's having difficulty with what kind of case, and we would problem solve a given case on that day. He decided he wanted to break the meeting up in two, and he wanted us to get more ready for the real world. So one person would present the same case every week. Week by week would either bring a recording or take very careful notes of what happened in the preceding week's session or sessions, and we would talk about the same person over and over and over again as the therapy continued to unfold. And I was the one he picked to present one of my cases. So I had the pleasure of having his total time and attention for 30 minutes every week as he and I were engaged in a back and forth about the client. And I loved that. That's one of the reasons why he was important to me. And my dissertation chairperson, Daniel Miller, was also one of the most influential people in my life. He was somebody who I admired. He was a wonderful preferred person who knew the literature of sociology and had one foot in psychoanalytic theory and one foot children learn to use. And it turns out it does, a very strong difference. What psychoanalysts pay attention to are not just autonomous things that rise in us, like it's part of our genetic makeup, but they're vastly learned and influenced, both the way we express the tortured problems we're in and the way we express adaptive mechanisms and our defense mechanism. They're highly loaded with who gave us what kind of child rearing treatments and what social position did we occupy. And he took an interest in me when I took his psychopathology class, and he asked me if he wanted to be one of the members of his research team that was doing pioneering research on the intersection of those things I talked about. He was in the process of co-writing a book with a sociologist, and each of the students he picked was going to write one of the chapters of those book with his help, and he would collaborate with them in writing one of the chapters of the book. So that opportunity really pulled at me and made me happy. I felt like I had the best dissertation chairperson possible until, oh my God, what I discovered. He called me into his office one day and said, "Stick close to me." I said, "What do you mean stick close to me?" He said, you're going to have to be careful around here. This was late in my fourth year, just as I was getting ready to go on my fifth year. I said, "What's happening?" He said, several of the faculty members have serious concerns about you. They're not sure you should get your degree. He said, "I'll protect you. Just stay close to me. You better be much quieter in classes and don't show off and don't ask for any attention. Try to become as invisible as you can in the last year of your coursework, and I'll make sure that nobody assassinates you." And boy, did I get frightened, and did I shut up. I found out at a reunion 30 years later that nobody at the faculty had anything bad to say about me. He was the only one behind my back who was going around bad-mouthing. So my feelings of love, affection, and respect for him turned to murder later in my life when I heard the real truth. That's my answer to your question. Anybody else?
Given the turmoil with your first wife, if you were to pick, and this is a weird question, but the one thing that you would look for in a life partner, the quality that would be something that, you know, would really be indicative of someone you would like to start a relationship with, what would it be?
Well, I can see in retrospect that she was incapable of doing the thing that Eric Berne talks about in games people play and in transactional analysis, something that influenced me. In order to have a viable and vibrant relationship with another human being, both parties have to move freely between three roles. Each has to be at some times the parent of the other, while the other is struggling with childlike hurts, childlike decompensation temporarily, and one has to take on the role of support, nurturer, and be selfless about attending to the temporary distress of the other person. And those roles shift. The person who was the parent at some periods of time later on comes apart himself or herself, and the other person has to become the parent. And then, for much stretches of time, they have to be equals. They have to be each other's companions and good friends and not need that kind of special care that has to be given at times of great distress in the marriage. And if you can't move freely between those three positions, then the relationship is going to get into terrible trouble. And my former wife and I were stuck. I was to parent her in sustaining ways, watch over her, provide for her, fill in her daydreams, take her secret fantasies and make them come true, overcome her feelings of being the ugly duckling, always love her no matter how cantankerous she got. I was to be parent, really. And what I was, what I needed, what I wanted did not matter one whit. We were never co-equals, and I could never be a child. She would scream at me, "You're acting like an infant," and walk out of the room. So that kind of flexibility is a prime thing I would look for. And I did look for him in the woman I've been married to for 49 years now.
Good answer.
Good. I think it's a good answer, too.
Yeah.
Anything else? Going once, going twice. gone. I will tell you about finishing up my training and the transition into real-life practice in my next lecture. Bye.
Thank you. Mhm.
See you later.
Bye.
Thanks, Arthur.